Hello students, I hope you are enjoying my lectures on literary theory. Literary theory, though it's not a part of the semester course which I am teaching, but for your sake actually you requested me for literary theory portion, and because you are also going to appear in UGC NET examination, so I thought that let me give you some video lectures on some important literary theories. So I have given you one lecture on new criticism, and I have also given you one video lecture on important terminology of structuralism. Now in this video lecture, I am going to discuss Russian formalism. This was also a request from the side of the students that since literary theory is quite complicated and the terminology which is used in literary theory is also quite confusing and difficult to understand. So they requested me to give some slides also. So in this video lecture, I have also provided some slides in order to make you understand it properly, because the name of the theorist, critics and the books, they seem to be difficult, so that will become quite easy for you if you look at the slides and watch the video lecture thoroughly. So let us now enjoy the lecture on Russian formalism. The way this topic is discussed with you, you'll be benefited, and you will also find out some important terms which are used here, and they are very often asked in UGC NET examination. Now, this Russian formalism was developed in Russia in early 20th century, around 1915, 2 years before Russian Revolution, which is an important historical event of 1917. Now, I have given my lecture on new criticism, and sometime it happens that when you start studying literary theories, then you also get confused with multiple theories. So this Russian formalism is also sometimes equated with new criticism. So I would like to tell you that Russian formalism is the European counterpart of Anglo-American new criticism, because there are so many points which are common between Russian formalism and new criticism. Now, one important point which you must know is that both Russian formalism and new criticism had their roots deeply planted on the idealism of Kant, as illustrated in his book Critique of Judgment, published in 1790. Now, this theory of formalism was the result of discussions that emerged from two important groups that I am going to tell you in next slide. Now, these two groups I'll tell you later. One is Opozas group, and the other is Moscow linguistic circle. I'll tell you in next slide. Now, this particular movement falls into three periods, because I have just told you this. It started around 1915. So I have categorized it, and this movement falls into three periods. One is 1916 to 21. Now, I'll tell you the various features of this movement, but before that, you just try to understand that there are three periods of this movement. Now, first is 1916 to 21. Now, in this period, the focus was on poetic language and prose composition. When I explain the basic meaning of formalism, then you will better understand it. Now, in 1916 to 21, the focus was on poetic language and prose composition. Then from 1921 to 8, when there was a serious attempt to re-examine many literary problems. And then the third, 1928 to 35, when the movement disbanded and disintegrated owing to several factors like political, historical, and all that. I'll tell you in my slides how this movement got suppressed, also. Now, how did it rise actually? This movement, formalism, rose to prominence as a reaction against romanticist theories of literature, which centered on the artist and individual creative genius, and instead placed the text itself back into the spotlight if you remember some important points from new criticism, the new criticism keeps the text at the very center. Now, this movement actually was against the Romanticist theories, which were considering their attention, on the artist and not on the, text. Now, formalism analyzes, interprets, and evaluates the internal features of the text. You've already studied in new criticism. Formalism analyzes, interprets, and evaluates the internal features of the text, and these internal features consist of grammar, syntax, and other rhetorical and literary devices. Now, one of the major concerns of formalism is unity in literature. What is this unity in literature? The coming together of various parts of the text to build up a whole. Now, who are the main proponents of this kind of theory? Now, this is also asked in UGC examination, that out of which theorist does not belong to the group of formalism or does not belong to the group of new criticism and all that. So you have to keep in mind all the major proponents, exponents of particular kind of theory. So we have this list. Leading members included Victor Slowacki, Tino Vladimir Prop, Boris Eichenbaum, Roman Jakobson, Boris Tomasky, Grigory Bukovsky. So we have Slowacki, we have Jakobson as important proponents. Now, I was talking about the three periods, and I also told you that this theory actually emerged out of the two groups, Opojay's group and the Moscow Linguistic Circle. So, there were two important groups, and the third emerged because one got, dissolved. So, the first formalist organization was this Moscow Linguistic Circle. You have to keep this in mind, because very often the questions are asked in the examination. The first formalist organization was this Moscow Linguistic Circle, which was formed in the year 1915, and the head of this organization was Roman Jakobson, a very important critic and theorist of this school. So you have to keep this in mind, that there was a first formalist organization, and it was known as the Moscow Linguistic Circle, and were headed by Roman Jakobson. Now, coming to second one, this is the Russian name which is written, and this the abbreviation of that is Opoyaz, Opoyaz. This is the meaning. The full form is Society for the Study of Poetic Language. This is actually the Russian word, Society for the Study of Poetic Language. It was founded in 1916 in St. Petersburg, and the members included Slowacki and Osip Brick. This is actually the second school or the group. Now, coming to the third is the Prague school. Now, what happened actually when the Moscow Linguistic Circle got disbanded in mid-1920s? All its members actually moved to Prague, and they have got varied agenda. This school actually continued its investigation into literary theory and linguistics, and their focus, their specialization was on now phonemic analysis of the works, and most prominent member became Roman Jakobson. Now, some important theorists, if you just remember some important statements of the famous theorists, so I think you will be able to understand formalism. Now, just look at the statement which was made by Roman Jakobson. He said, "The subject of literary scholarship is not literature in its totality, but literariness, that is, that which makes of a given work a work of literature." This is said by Roman Jakobson. In the first line, the subject of literary scholarship is not a literature in its totality. The word is actually its. Second statement was made by another theorist, Boris Eichenbaum. He said the literary scholar ought to be concerned solely with the inquiry into the distinguishing features of literary materials. And the third statement was by Victor Slowacki. He said, art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of object. The object is not important. Now, you just keep these three famous statements in your mind. So I think you'll be able to understand the basic features of formalism. Now, what basically formalism is? Now, so far what you have studied in traditional, criticism, from say, 18th, 19th century, except modern criticism, that the approach was basically the approach to study the literature was different. The biographical, psychological, socio-economic, details of the author were taken to analyze, the poem. Now, what happened in the first part of the 20th century, when we have formalism, when we have new criticism, now shift from moral approach to scientific approach. Now, this is actually one important point which you'll find out in formalism. Shift from moral approach to scientific approach. What is that? It focuses almost exclusively on features of the literary text itself, to the exclusion of biographical, historical, and intellectual context. No context is taken into consideration. So, exclusion of biographical, historical, social, economic, intellectual, all the contexts were discarded, and what was important? The literary text itself. Now, what is the second important feature which you'll find out? Formalists focus on the intrinsic nature of the text. Again, we have the continuation of that. Let me tell you that, when you talk about new criticism is also got intrinsic criticism because it focuses on the intrinsic worth of the text. Now, formalists focus on the intrinsic nature of the text, excluding external factors such as the author, reader, historical context, cultural context of the piece of work. I have just told you in the first line that all the external factors are discarded by formalists, and formalists focused on the intrinsic nature of the text. Now, third important point which you will find out is emphasis on delinking text to author or text to society. Text is delinked from author and delinked from society. If we have this point in continuation, that in short, if you want to say, you will say that in Russian formalism, emphasis is on delinking text to the author or text to society. Text is separated from the society and text is separated from the author. Now, next, what a literary work says cannot be separated from how the literary work says. I'll tell you later. This is in connection with form and content. What a literary work says is the content, cannot be separated from how the literary work says is the form. So, what a literary work says cannot be separated from how the literary work says. Now, formalism, like structuralism, sought to place the study of literature on a scientific basis through objective analysis of what are those points which are analyzed: motifs, devices, techniques, and other functions. I'll tell you later that this formalism had its impact on structuralism, which you're going to study later. Now, the next point we will find out is neither author nor context was essential for the formalist. Then what was important? It was the narrative that spoke. Now, in continuation with that, emphasis is on form, not on content. form was content for these formalists. Now, since literature is made of language, linguistics will be a foundational element of the science of literature. What is the main important point which they are focusing on? Linguistics. Emphasis on linguistic aspect, not on exophora. Now, what you just look at the word. They emphasized on linguistic aspect, not an exophora, a word which you must learn. Exophora means reference in a text to something external to it, which I am describing, which is only fully intelligible in terms of information about the extra linguistic situation. This is the meaning of exophora. Now, next is literature is autonomous from external conditions in the sense the literary language is distinct from ordinary uses of language. This you are also going to learn by the use of some technical terms. Now, one of the key principles of Russian formalism is literariness. Now, this word you must learn because it's a very important word used by Russian formalists, and this is also asked sometimes in your examination. One of the key principles of Russian formalism is literariness. Now, the term literariness was first introduced by Russian formalist Roman Jakobson in 1921. These kind of questions are asked in your examination. Now, literariness, what is this? Literariness is a literary quality of a text which distinguishes between literary text with non-literary text. Now, Jakobson declared in his work Modern Russian Poetry that object of literary science is not literature but literariness. And what is this? What makes a given work a literary work. This is literariness. Now, we have again the two important words, technical words, which are included, Fabula and syuzhet. Now, here I have written for Structuralism. For him, actually, this syuzhet is plot and the fabula is story. Now, what is this fabula? The fabula is the raw material of a story, and syuzhet is the way the story is organized. For Structuralism, this plot is the story defamiliarized. That is, it creates a defamiliarizing effect upon fabula. I'll explain this defamiliarization later. Now, the plot story distinction, for example, this is again a very important point which is discussed by these formalists. This is the distinction between the sequence of event the text relates, the story, from the sequence in which those events are presented in the work, that is the plot. By emphasizing how the plot of any fiction naturally diverges from chronological sequence of its story, Structuralism was able to emphasize the importance of paying an extraordinary amount of attention to the plot, that is, the form of a text, so as to understand its meaning. So, one important point which you have come to know here is that they have also tried to make a difference between these two terms, fabula and syuzhet, plot and story. And for Structuralism, actually, plot, which is the form, actually is more important. So you have also such kind of question in your examination. Now, this I'm going to tell you this word defamiliarization. It is again a very important term which is used by formalists. Now, it's a theory and technique in which an artistic or literary work presents familiar objects or situations in an unfamiliar way. You just try to understand it. An artistic or literary work presents familiar objects or situations in an unfamiliar way. Now, this concept, this familiarization is the opposite of automatization. This concept is particularly associated with Structuralism and discussed in his Art as Technique, first published in 1917. You also have the question on defamiliarization in your examination. Now, he argued that defamiliarization is more or less the point of all art. Art makes language strange as well as the world and the language presents. Defamiliarization, literally, the meaning is estrangement or making it strange. Now, putting it in more simple term, defamiliarization refers to a writer's taking an everyday object that we all recognize and with a wave of his or her authorial magic wand rendering the same object unfamiliar to us, strange even. That is why the meaning is making it strange. So the normal events presented in the very extraordinary manners. Now you see the usual example given for this is that walking. Okay, walking is the walking basically is a habitual activity, and it goes generally unnoticed by us. Now, dancing too uses the movements of the limbs, but the dance is seen and enjoyed, not the walking. And dance actually also draws our attention. So a dance basically is a walk which is felt. It is a walk constructed to be felt. It is made that way to make us feel it. Similarly, what happens, what these formalists are saying, the everyday language we use in our daily commerce is rendered strange in poetry. Why we are going to study it? Because it is rendered strange in poetry on account of the formal devices such as rhyme, rhythm, acting upon it. Then there are some examples which are given there by these formalists are Gogol's overcoat and Stern's Tristram, Shandy. These are the examples which are given by these formalists. So, what is this defamiliarization? It refers to the literary device, whereby language is used in such a way that ordinary and familiar objects are made to look different. It is a process of transformation where language asserts its power to affect our perception. It is that aspect which differentiates between ordinary uses and poetic use of language and imparts a uniqueness to a literary work. So this defamiliarization actually gives uniqueness to a literary work by transforming ordinary uses into the poetic use of language. Now, you see another related term is used is deformation. Okay, Russian formalists, they use the term deformation, and this word, generally the word deformation is used in negative sense, but these formalists have used the term deformation in a positive sense. What is this deformation? It suggests the changes imposed on the material of the poem and the resultant effects. This is also the device which is used by these formalists. Now, there are two important texts, narrative texts, which are taken by the Russian formalists. One is Jonathan Swift's Gulliver Travels, and the other is Lawrence Stern's The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy. These are the examples actually which are taken by these formalists. Now, sometimes it happens that you study the different terms also, and you find that there is a lot of similarity. Now this term is also very often asked in the examination, and you will find out some points of similarities and dissimilarities in all these terms. Alienation effect, I think you are familiar with. Now this alienation effect you must have heard in connection with Bertolt Brecht and the epic theatre. Now this is a kind of more or less the same technique. This is a similar technique deployed in drama and known as alienation effect, and it was introduced by Bertolt Brecht in his epic theatre to disrupt the passive complacency of the audience and force them into critical analysis of art as well as the world. So they are alienated actually in order to Hellenise the text. If you remember that this concept of deep familiarization it seems to us that we have some similarities with the Romantic critic Coleridge when he was talking about making common looking uncommon in Biographia Literaria, which was published in 1817. Now, because the terms like willing suspension of disbelief and all that, and the agreement between Wordsworth and Coleridge regarding the publication of the poems in lyrical ballads, and how they agreed that Wordsworth will choose common subjects and make uncommon, and Coleridge choose uncommon and make them common, something like that. So this in Biographia Literaria. We have some kind of similarity, but it was conceived in terms of subject matter and novelty of expression. Now, how they are talking about the subject matter, but what about the formalists? The formalists actually want to bring the defamiliarization effect of novelty by the use of linguistic devices such as rhyme, meter, metaphor, image, and symbols, etc. Now, there are some points of similarities between formalism and new criticism. Generally, they are taken as same because both of them focus on the text on the page actually, and they discard the external influences. Now, however, these new critics see all text as autotelic. Now, this word is very significant. Autotelic means self-contained. I told you that text is an entity in itself, as new critics say. So, American critics see all text as autotelic and do not need any reference external to the text to assign meaning. And further, American new critics use linguistic structures like paradox, imagery, metaphor to arrive at what it sees as a text organic unity. Now, when you come to Russian formalism, by contrast, was less practical and more abstract and theoretical. But more or less, new criticism, is a part of the formalist approach. Now, you see, there are some critics who criticized this formalist theory. They are the detractors, and they did not like actually the approach of these formalists. So we have René Velick, Julia Kristeva, and Marxist writers, and Leon Trotsky. They are actually the critics who criticized this formalist theory. They found actually some weaknesses in this theory of art. Now, René Velick pointed out. And he said that they have these formalists have chosen a technical scientific approach to art, and that would dehumanize art and destroy criticism. This was actually the objection which was laid by René Velick, because ultimately the critic put the idea that this way poetry will be reduced to a game or a puzzle if you make it more scientific and technical. This was one weakness which is found by René Velick. Now, Julia Kristeva, another important critic, condemns the mechanical idealism of these formalists. He wrote an essay called "The Ruins of a Poetics." The Ruins of a Poetics. Now, she says that the literary text is reduced to mere linguistic categories and theories. What is this? I mean, there is no way that these formalists are focusing on only the linguistic categories, and that is not good. Now, the Marxists called the ideologies of these formalists as reactionary, and they attacked these formalists for ignoring the social dimensions and utilitarian function of art. I told you that how Marxists actually attacked these writers and said that why external factors are also responsible for the composition of the text, so how can it be ignored? Now, then we have Leon Trotsky. Now, he also attacked them, and he called actually the Russian formalism superficial, childish, narrow, and defective. And the critic continued, it had separated the superstructure from the base. Now these two terms I have used that I'll tell you later in different kind of theory. So these are actually the objections which were laid by these critics, René Vallée, Julia Kristeva, and the Marxist critics, and Leon Trotsky, etc. Now, this kind of theory also had the influence on the thinkers. The major influence was on Bakhtin and Yuri Lotman, and also the structuralist linguistic theory, which you are going to study later on. So what I have told you so far, that in this lecture I have discussed a different kind of terms which are used by these formalists. I told you the beginning of this movement around 1915. I told you that Russian formalism is the European counterpart of Anglo-American New Criticism. I told you that they have drawn some points from Kant's critique of judgment, and the basic purpose of these formalists was that they were talking about the organic whole, to build up a whole. And I also talked about the various exponents, various practitioners of this kind of theory, like Roman Jakobson and all. And I also discussed the two kinds of schools, Moscow Linguistic Circle and this Opoyas, and then ultimately this Prague school, where Roman Jakobson became the prominent practitioner. And then I also discussed some important quotes by some theorists in order to understand the basic and important features of formalism. These were the important features of formalism which I discussed, and I told you that the emphasis of these formalist theorists was on delinking text to author or text to society, and for them form was the content. So they were another point which I discussed with you was that this term literariness. Now the term like literariness and foregrounding, they were the terms actually which were introduced by them. I explained the term literariness. Then these two terms, Fabula and syuzhet, were introduced by these theorists in order to make a difference between plot and story, to explain the importance of form. I also drew your attention on the term defamiliarization, which is a very important term used by these formalists. Then I also talked about alienation effect, which is the same kind of the point which is found in drama. I also told you about Coleridge, and I also discussed some points of similarities between Russian formalism and New Criticism. And there are some detractors, some critics who criticized the concept of formalism. I told you how René Vallée, Julia Kristeva, Marxist writers, and Leon Trotsky criticized this concept. I also told about the influence of Russian formalism on different theorists who are very prominent theorists at present, Bakhtin and the structuralist theory. Thank you very much.